We want to welcome you to Kigali, Rwanda.
When Jesus came on, he came down from heaven.
For 1 week from the 17th of April, Anglican leaders from across the globe will be gathering in Kigali, Rwanda.
This is going to be a crucial time.
There was trouble, God sent him down to Africa.
In terms of the future of the Anglican Communion, it'll quite possibly be the most important meeting since the Reformation.
Come on now.
Which gospel will we proclaim? My fear is in the Church of England, we're so desperate to hold the whole thing together, we're in danger of completely losing the gospel.
We believe in Christ Jesus, who has come to the world to die for us.
We must praise him.
We've assembled a multi-nation team to work together to bring you the key conference moments and the beating gospel heart of faithful ministry from across the Anglican Communion.
We find ourselves as doing ministry at the front line of the mission field of northern Kenya.
The emotion, the joy, the heartbreak of pastors, lay members, bishops and primates.
Yeah, you just made the beauty of Brazil, and now you got this man like this.
We'd love you to tune in from the 17th of April and also to help fund our broadcast.
Just shake your body to the Lord. Just give him a dance.
Join us for the Heart of GAFCON live from the Kigali foyer from April 17 on thepastorsheart.net.
Praising in the African way.
It is the Pastor's Heart. It's Dominic Steele. And how can we best support gospel growth beyond our church? Our guest is Mikey Lynch. How do we relate to other organisations in the grand cause of reaching the world for Christ? The church, the denomination, movements, parachurches. Mikey Lynch is a director of Reach Australia. He's the new editorial director for the Gospel Coalition Australia, and he leads the staff team doing campus ministry at Hobart at the University of Tasmania. He has just published this significant new book, The Vine Movement, Supporting Gospel Growth Beyond Your Church, with Matthias Media. It raises all sorts of issues, the relationship between what I'll call our little church and movements and denominations and parachurch organisations, and how us as pastors relate to those things and how the leaders of those things relate to us. In the book, it is clear there are, lots of tensions and complexities, and it felt to me as I was reading it that Mikey was lifting the lid, lifting the bonnet on a whole set of complexities and difficulties of how we function together as an evangelical whole, with all sorts of different goals and sub-goals and centres of leadership, and Mikey, competing pastors' hearts.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, it's personal and spiritual, not just organisational, for sure.
How do the different entities and the different leaders relate, and what are the problems that we have in relating?
One of the great documents that I drew on in writing the book was prepared by the Lausanne Conference for World Evangelisation, and it was a document that came out of consultation between a whole lot of different mission organisations and parachurch groups years ago now, I think from the 1980s possibly. And one of the things that they said in the paper was that almost embarrassingly they found that the recurring theme was just how important good communication was. And that certainly rings true to me as well. It just seems that so often, like you say, because it involves pastors' hearts, because we're emotionally invested and insecure and sometimes ambitious, and we can take things the wrong way, so many of the difficulties are caused by that, and so actually that prayerful, humble, loving, generous, listening spirit is just a really fundamental one. And out of that there are important theological, governance, institutional things that need to happen, but that really is a central one, and so often that's where things go wrong, sadly.
You spend a lot of time talking about parachurches, but you also, and the relationship between the parachurch and the church, but you also talk about movements in the church and denominations at the church. Before we define parachurch, we need to define church.
In defining church, you need to first begin with the universal church and understanding that is the gathering of all those who are saved and gathered with Christ. But then that universal church manifests itself in local churches on earth. which I've defined, I don't have the page in front of me, but something along the lines of a formal community of Christians who gather for the purpose of praying and hearing the word and ordering its affairs and loving one another, that kind of thing. So it's the formal gathering for the purpose of hearing and responding to God's word in community with one another. And then there's the denomination is in a sense another extended meaning that I'd want to suggest there's some good reason to see that still as an extension of the church, not simply a parachurch, although different denominations have different views on that point.
I thought it was quite interesting, actually. You're writing with a background in Presbyterianism, and you were wanting to say the primacy of the local congregation rather than the network as a whole, and you were quite keen to limit the powers of bishops, which I had a great deal of sympathy with your position there.
Well, both Presbyterians and Anglicans have these two variations. You could see it as like a top-down view where the church is first of all embodied in the national church or the bishops, or however, whether you're Presbyterian or Anglican, or whether it's constituted bottom up, in which case whether it's the presbytery or the bishop are there to serve the local churches fundamentally. And I've got much more sympathy for the bottom up democratic view of church and denomination rather than the top down aristocratic view, as people sometimes describe the two of them.
It was interesting to read this, read these words that you've written after the big crisis that Hillsong has been through, whereas you, I'm sure, wrote these words before it was public, the big crisis that Hillsong had been through. And just as I was reflecting on these words, I was thinking, perhaps 4 years ago, even though theologically I had differences with Hillsong, I did admire the way that they had grown so exponentially and grown with such visionary leadership. And yet, I suppose you'd say we're seeing now a whole lot of the checks and balances that the denominations have put in place from years of long experience weren't in place in that organisation. I wonder, it was quite interesting to read your words and reflect on what's happened since you wrote those words.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I put pen to paper on most of the stuff in the book before there was the scandals with Acts 29 and accusations around Steve Timmis, before Ravi Zacharias, before the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, before the recent Hillsong scandals. And it did feel like, although there's a little bit of updating you can do in the editorial process, at the same time it just made me go, this highlights how valuable the book is. It's really trying to do applied polity, church polity, ecclesiology, in the light of what we have, are learning about healthy governance, and bringing those two together and to say, actually, healthy Christian movements and mission and so on needs to both pay attention to the free work of God's Spirit through His people, and also the way in which good order is given for a reason. There's even in the book a really interesting quote from Mark Knoll evaluating the legacy of George Whitefield and saying, there were enormous strengths to Whitefield's immense evangelistic ministry in the 18th century, and yet Knoll says in many ways we can see a lot of the problems of modern independent evangelicalism in the United States in the way Whitefield went about it. And that's just a really interesting thought, to go even those early days of both Whitefield and especially then Methodism in the United States led to exponential growth, but brought with it a lot of the issues we see in evangelical Christianity in the United States today. Yeah.
So what theological place and practical weight ought to be granted to denominational organisations?
Part of what I try and argue in the book is that in the first place we do need to just talk and get comfortable talking about the importance of ecclesiology and polity on that question of denominations, even if we don't all reach the same point. I think as I was becoming a Christian and getting involved in Christian ministry, it was quite common to hear those leaders over me to say denominations they're just a parachurch, they're nothing, that's not something to worry about, they're like expressions like it's just a platform to use or a boat to fish from, that's it. I want to argue more than that, to go, no, people do reach a range of convictions about the place of how churches relate to one another. And those convictions may differ, but they're important convictions. So I guess that's just without me answering the question, I think that's important. But secondly, I think regardless of where you land, even if you're like a Baptist, Congregationalist, independent convictions with where you land, then I think it's still right to say that the Baptist network is a first, even if you're seeing it as kind of a parachurch, it's the first parachurch amongst many. It's one to which there's a certain degree of primacy of resourcing and interdependence and some level of accountability, even if it's advisory rather than disciplinary. So I guess that, at the very least, that it's the first parachurch amongst many. If not, actually, it is part of the way local churches are rightly disciplined and governed, is actually through that network of relationship between other churches.
So, what is a parachurch?
I go for a really broad definition in the book, because I think it is a broad phenomenon, and I think if you define it too strictly and narrowly, you miss out on understanding just the mix of things. So the way I define it is a, what do I go for? It is organised Christian activity outside of the visible institutional church. That is, it's organised, doesn't necessarily have a constitution, but it's deliberate, not just kind of totally incidental. So it's organised. It's Christian activity. I don't mean it must be disciple-making activity. So an organised, Christian-motivated charity activity, I would say, is a form of parachurch activity. And then it's outside of the visible institutional church. That is, it has some degree of distance from church and its leaders and its organisation and its discipline, both the local church and the denomination. And so that distance can have a range of differences to it, but there'll be some degree of distinction. Yep.
And you talk about presumptuous parachurches, that there are, within the parachurch movement, there are some that are presumptuous. What do you mean by that?
I'm trying to capture the fact that just because something actually does a whole lot of the stuff that properly belongs to the church doesn't therefore make it a church, but just makes it a parachurch that's being presumptuous and inappropriate. If you have a parachurch which takes on all of the holistic disciple members and presumes to then administer the sacraments and conduct some form of discipline and a bunch of these things, that doesn't therefore necessarily mean it's a church, but it's just a parachurch that is massively overreaching. And that's a helpful distinction to have. While at the same time realising there does get a point where a presumptuous parachurch is so persistent in its presumptuousness, or to use different language, has so shifted to take on that full range of roles and responsibilities that it is best to say this is a de facto church. Let's call it what it is and constitute it as it is, which is what happened with Methodism, what happened with the Salvation Army over a very long, over a lifetime. That's eventually what happened with them.
You pick up on a 1974 article by Ralph Winter, which has been extraordinarily influential in this space, and he deals with the concepts of modality and sodality. Now, I got some questions that I wanted to pick up with you on that, but perhaps you could just define those terms in this context first.
Yeah, sure. So Ralph Winter is a missiologist who wrote this article called The Two Redemptive Structures, I think of God's People or God's Mission, something like that. And he took the term sodality, which comes out of Roman Catholicism, to describe like monastic and religious orders, as kind of the Catholic precursor to parachurches and modern mission organisations. So sodality is that kind of a parachurch, if you like. And then modality is the term he used to describe the established, sedentary, holistic, local church. So really but by using those two terms, what he was trying to do was relativise the local church and say it was one structure alongside the sodality, and the two together were like twin structures, equally important and equally significant in God's purpose for God's people and God's mission. That's kind of his thesis.
I found that interesting because I came across those two terms in ministry lectures from Philip Jensen in the mid-90s, and his argument at the time was modality Australia, sodality the Australian Army. The Army's got a purpose, whereas Australia, you just part of it. You know, most churches are modalities, but churches ought to be sodalities. We ought to have the vibe in our church that we were focused on mission, like the army is committed to defence. And so I found it interesting that Winter said parachurches could be sodalities, but churches by default were to be modalities. Whereas I want to try and persuade our church to be a sodality. What was your reaction to that?
I haven't come across that particular use of the term. So whether that's like a lot of Philip's, creative and out-of-the-box thinking definition that he brought to the conversation, I haven't come across that one. I've normally heard it very much as being coming out of that Roman Catholic background, for it not only to be a purpose, but a narrow purpose and a narrow membership. So the army... so a nation may all be involved in the war effort and so have a purpose, like Philip's trying to call on it to have, but that doesn't mean every civilian is a combatant, and therefore mass bogging of a population is not a war crime because everyone's a combatant. Do you see what I mean? So not everybody needs to sign on to the same commitments that a missionary, like a mobile cross-cultural missionary team, signs on for, much less a monastic order's vows. And so those are some of the things that the sodality thing captures, whereas the modality is the the range of services, the only demands are the demands of the gospel itself.
What are the frustrations that we local church pastors are likely to have with the parachurch? One of the frustrations can be the struggle to actually gather the resources and the team to continue the local work. And so it can seem like sometimes the best of people's energy and money and time goes to some other organisation rather than the local church, and that even then their relational belonging and loyalty can belong outside of the local church as well. So that can cause a great deal of frustration, I think, when I like to use an example from campus ministry, when some of the best people and most available people to help run kids and youth ministries and serve in band ministries, for example, in church, if they're so busy with such an heavily programmed campus ministry, then suddenly they're not able to serve in the local church. And the pastor finds themselves sitting there going, surely you could just cut back your program, please. And if you cut back your program with the parachurch, they could do both. And so it's that imaginative collaboration that says, why not both? Rather than a zero-sum game, church versus parachurch, go, well, what are ways that we could both reduce our expectations, manage our programming and calendars and commitments, so that there's some kind of, compromise that's possible. I mean, an example like that may be also to flip the commitment back the other way. It may be that a church that has a high commitment to small group ministry could say, we recognise the value of also the equivalent value of small group ministries in, say, a parachurch work, and so we can see those as being equivalent for a season, and so we don't insist on every single member without exception has to be a part of our church growth group ministry. We may, with wisdom and discretion, allow some flexibility at times. So I was thinking that sort of stuff through, how you weigh up a both-and approach. And the frustration comes when you feel like the other person in the equation is not thinking both-and, but is thinking as much as possible. And when that gets coupled with a rhetoric of, we are God's gift to the world, look, trust us, Dominic, give us your people, and we'll give them back to you later, and they'll be better off having been with us entirely. That kind of mindset. That can lead to resentment from the pastor as well, where they go, hang on, the ministry in my church is pretty good too, thank you, and so on. What about the frustration? I mean, I found it interesting, the chapter you had on the frustrations parachurch leaders have with pastors. Yeah, look, I mean, there are real frustrations and then there are perceived frustrations. We can both have things in either direction. But certainly one is that parachurch leaders sometimes are more proactive in planning their programs, their commitments. They line up people, the people say yes, they plan the structures around it, and then with 5 weeks to go, pastor runs in a panic and says, I haven't organised Easter, comes to these people and says, we need you to do all these things for Easter at the last minute. And because they're the pastor of the local church, which has this deeper gravitas to it, suddenly people, having committed to something to the parachurch months prior, dump all that and say, sorry, I can't anymore because pastor needs me, that kind of thing. And so that can be one of the frustrations that can sometimes happen, is when a parachurch works hard to plan in advance and communicates their plans in advance,
and then a disorganised, panicked pastor, having not taken the time to balance these things together, accidentally throws the punters into a kind of a zero-sum game when that could have been avoided.
It sounds like as you tell that story, you're not speaking as if it's completely abstract.
Oh, mate. No, look, neither. I mean, I was a pastor for, a number of years as well, so I've experienced both. But yeah, absolutely, that's a very common one, whether it's, volunteers for a last-minute mission or scheduling of camps and conferences or any number of things, yeah. But I've also experienced the positive when there's proactive calendaring, communicating, shared pastoring of members. And gosh, that is awesome when it happens well. Yeah.
You talk about how pastors can invest in the wider gospel ecosystem, so actually effectively pastor with parachurch movements, denominations for the best outcome. What advice do you have for us on that?
Well, I mean, you could go back and listen to a earlier Pastor's Heart episode where you chatted with Archie Poulos about that. So I think this is singing from his hymn book very much at this point. It's a mindset in the first place. The earlier Trellis and Vine books spoke about thinking gospel growth, not just church growth. Thinking about what God is doing in the world, not simply what I am doing for God and what God's doing in my little patch. And so in the first place, it's a mindset of going, what is win? What is success? What is the goal of my ministry work? Well, it's got to be a broader impact than simply, the measurement of attendance and giving and these kinds of things in my local church. So in the first place, a mindset. In the second place, I think, just like with any value or commitment, if you're a strategic planner on any level, you build in structures along those lines. So just as you might pray and communicate announcements for your local church, do you do that for your denomination and your mission partners? Proactive communication from and to your mission partners and sharing the church community in that is such a low bar, but it is one that a lot of churches don't do. And so to do that, suddenly it is immensely encouraging to your mission partners and incredibly engaging to your church members to just go, just as I plan communicating the church camp, so also I plan communicating our mission partners overseas and locally and how they're going and what to pray for them and so on.
In the book, you talk about the relationship of the local church with a broader parachurch organisation, a movement, something like Reach Australia, of which you're the director, but also relating to your own individual denomination as a church pastor. And you talked about the tension the local leader is going to feel between, if you like, the family, the blood family of the denomination, and friends in the wider movement. Do you just want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, I use it as an analogy, so not to draw on kind of the spiritual terminology of church as the household of God, but just to use it as an analogy to say there is a kind of loyalty that belongs with our denominational allegiance. As I suggested, at the very least, it's kind of a first parachurch amongst many. But by analogy, you can kind of think about it in perhaps the way you conduct yourself with your family and your extended family, that just because there is this certain kind of blood is thicker than water loyalty that comes with family, that may not necessarily reflect your calendar next week. You may spend more time with friends and colleagues and shared hobbyists next week than you do with your cousins, and yet there's a certain claim that your cousins may have on you because of that family connection. And I think that's, it's a loose ethical kind of metaphor, but I think it can be a helpful one in the way we think about it, and an important one to hear for the big A Anglicans, the big P Presbyterians, who have an assumption that if you're really an Anglican or really a Presbyterian, then you should be 100% behind every scheme of the church, every structure of the church, and I'm a little bit hurt, if not kind of outraged, if you dare support something that isn't the endorsed denominational program. I've hurt or offended, and to that I'd say, gosh, that's just not how that relationship and loyalty actually looks in any number of relationships, corporate, family, ecclesial. It's just not the way it works.
It's interesting as you say that, Mikey, because your experience in Presbyterianism and mine in the Sydney Anglican network have both essentially been where the guys above us in ministry have been good guys, theologically good guys, and pretty much on the same page in terms of mission strategy. I'm thinking, though, that there's quite a few people watching us, listening to us around the world at the moment, where the people above them are not theologically good guys. I'm particularly thinking in the Church of England, that kind of thing, where it's a whole different set of tensions when the bishop over you or the presbytery over you does not endorse the same gospel that you endorse.
Oh, look, absolutely, and that raises really significant tensions about. I mean, in the first place, you experience the same thing in relationship with, Christians' relationship to civil government or to honouring your parents, or, any number of these things where you go, the principle of honour of the uniform, if you like, of the structure, doesn't necessarily always map to obedience and alignment with a specific instruction or belief. And there comes a point in any of those things where rebellion or departure is actually the appropriate response as well. Where you go, like, things have gotten to such a point that I tragically feel compelled by conscience and by the truth to divide. And look, that can be over doctrinal things. It can be over practice as well. You can say that on paper the doctrine's fine, but the way it is being enacted, lived out, is so scandalous that I feel I'm compromised by being attached to the unrepentant in practice. And in a sense, you get an example of that, say, in Presbyterianism going back 2 centuries to the great split where the Free Church of Scotland came. You could see it as a doctrinal thing, but you could just see it as a practice thing, that it came out of giving too much power to the local landholders in being able to say yes or no to the appointment of a minister. And it got to a point where the Evangelical said, no, the minister is not beholden to the local wealthy guy who pays for the building. They're responsible to God, and they're responsible to the people of God. So in this ministry practice, not the doctrine, but the practice in a sense, is so scandalous we can't put up with it anymore. So sometimes it's even that. The doctrine's fine. It's the practice that leads to tragically sometimes having to distance ourselves, even organisationally.
Mikey, I want to come back and do the third section of this book later, where you do, if you like, case studies on these different parachurch movements, and so I'm going to get you back on in a few weeks' time and pick up on some of those things. But just before we say goodbye, you were telling me on the phone the other day in your work in the campus ministry at the University of Tasmania in Hobart that there's been a massive change in just the whole campus dynamic compared to pre-COVID to now. Could you just give us a bit of an insight into what's going on the ground in the campus in Tasmania?
Yeah, sure. I love your prayers for this. I mean, UTAS is at the extreme end of current university experiences. There'll be other campuses similar to us, but many others where their experience is way less dramatic. So don't take our case as reflecting everything. And in some ways it's a perfect storm, I think. I think it's a result of the impacts of COVID and then strict COVID-safe policies after even government policy change. That was a factor. The shift to online learning for large lectures has been another major shift at UTAS. And then also it's in the process of a move of all the campuses into the centre of the city, which has become quite a scandalous and unpopular thing in the local media. And so there's a series of things all happening at once. And then you might add in even larger scale processes like the gradual decline in Christianity in the wider population, or the gradual ageing of the Tasmanian population. Some of these other factors are probably in the mix as well. What that's meant has been just the local university student ministry amongst Australian-born and high English competency students has just been not quite decimated, but close to. It's really shrunk dramatically. Perhaps the closest near comparison might be when universities en masse might have stopped doing common lunch hours in a bunch of places, and you could just no longer gather hundreds of students easily at a single time slot anymore. Perhaps is the closest, but yeah, I mean, I think it's been a mix of actual programming structures as well as then sociological triggers that mean that local students at least struggle to engage and connect and network and build friends and just prioritise and follow through. All the while anecdotally saying that they hate the online experience, but they're doing it's like people who hate Facebook but can't get off it. It's that kind of hate smoking but can't kick the habit. I don't like the online learning, but it's so convenient I can't kick the habit. Yeah, that's right. So that's just the mission field that we can't talk. I mean, we weren't doing this anyway as much, but we cannot talk about campus ministry in many places. We can't. I mean, this is true in France as well. You can't really talk about it geographically as to the campus as a geographical location, because in the case of, say, France, you can't get on the campus anyway. In the case of increasing number of places in Australia, even if you could get on the campus, you wouldn't want to be there because there's hardly anyone there, or a dramatically less amount. So you have to pivot to a network ministry among the young adults of our cities and suburbs to ensure that evangelism and training up leaders is taking place, rather than going, the society is gathering them all, literally geographically. That's in many places, I suspect we might see this split, a widening split between high-tier sandstone and newer universities that maintain a centre, gravitational pull, and then a large number of universities that have all the same challenges that trying to do a ministry to TAFE students has. You know, there's a reason why we've struggled to ever have ministries quite like the CUs amongst TAFE students, and I think we may see more of that same challenge amongst a significant chunk of universities around the country as well.
Mikey Lynch, thanks for talking to us this afternoon. Mikey Lynch has been my guest. He's a director of Reach Australia, the new editorial director of Gospel Coalition Australia, and he leads the staff team doing campus ministry in Hobart at the University of Tasmania. This has been Dominic Steele. Thanks for joining us on The Pastor's Heart, and we will look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon.